By noon, Robert Harmon's car was found abandoned at a Virginia rest stop. The engine was still warm. His wallet was still inside. His briefcase sat untouched on the passenger seat. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood. Within hours, federal agents took control of the scene. And before the sun set that evening, the FBI made a decision that would shape the next 33 years. They told Robert Harmon's family that he had defected. On the morning of October 14, 1987, Robert Harmon woke up at 6:10 a.m., just as he did every weekday. The alarm rang once. He reached over, turned it off, and sat up slowly. Margaret Harmon later recalled that nothing about that morning felt unusual. Robert showered, shaved, and dressed in the same dark slacks and button-down shirt he wore to work every day. He poured himself a cup of coffee, skimmed the newspaper headlines, and packed his briefcase with documents he had reviewed the night before. At 7:05 a.m., he ate breakfast with his wife and their 2 daughters. At 7:18 a.m., he kissed Margaret on the cheek. At 7:20 a.m., Robert Harmon walked out the front door. That was the last confirmed moment anyone ever saw him alive. Robert Harmon was 46 years old at the time of his disappearance. He worked as a senior intelligence systems analyst for a Department of Defense subcontractor based in Northern Virginia. His role involved reviewing and testing secure communications software used by multiple federal agencies. He was not an undercover operative. He did not travel overseas. He did not carry a weapon. Most of his work was done in windowless offices, analyzing code, reviewing reports, and flagging irregularities in system performance. Colleagues described him as meticulous, cautious, and quietly principled. "He wasn't loud," one former coworker later said. But when he said something was wrong, people listened. Outside of work, Robert lived a routine life. He coached youth baseball on weekends when his schedule allowed. He attended school events. He fixed small things around the house and kept detailed notes on household expenses. Margaret described him as predictable to a fault. "He hated surprises," she said. He liked things to make sense, which made what happened next impossible to understand. Robert was expected to arrive at his office in Arlington by 8:15 a.m. At 8:30, no one noticed he was missing. At 9:00, Margaret assumed traffic delays. At 9:45, she began to worry. At 10:20 a.m., she called Robert's office. His assistant told her he had not arrived. By 11:00 a.m., Margaret called again. By 11:30, she contacted local police. At 12:04 p.m., a Virginia state trooper patrolling Interstate 95 pulled into a highway rest stop near Fredericksburg. He noticed a dark sedan parked alone near the far edge of the lot. The engine hood was still warm to the touch. Inside the car, everything appeared normal. Robert Harmon's wallet was in the center console. His briefcase sat upright, neatly closed. There were no signs of forced entry. The keys were missing. The trooper ran the plates and learned the vehicle was registered to a man reported missing less than an hour earlier. By 12:40 p.m., local police were on scene. By 1:15 p.m., federal agents arrived. The moment the FBI took control, the tone of the investigation changed. Local officers were instructed to step back. The vehicle was sealed off, photographs were taken, items were cataloged. Margaret Harmon arrived at the scene shortly after 2:00 p.m. She was not allowed to approach the car. Instead, she was escorted to a separate area and questioned. They asked about Robert's work. They asked about his stress levels. They asked about money. They did not ask if anyone might have hurt him. That evening, 2 FBI agents sat across from Margaret in her living room. They spoke calmly. Formally, carefully. They told her they believed Robert had likely left on his own. When Margaret asked why, they cited his access to classified information. When she asked where he would go, they offered no country. When she asked for evidence, they offered none. By midnight, the word defection had entered the file. Within 48 hours, the defection theory solidified. Robert's bank accounts were examined. His passport records were checked. His phone records were reviewed. Nothing suggested preparation. No withdrawals, no calls, no foreign contacts. Still, the theory remained because it was simple, and simplicity required no suspects. Once the word defection appeared in Robert Harmon's file, everything that followed was filtered through that assumption. Investigators no longer asked what might have happened to him. They asked why he would leave. Every detail of Robert's life was reinterpreted as possible motive. A late night at work became suspicious. A disagreement with a supervisor became resentment. A quiet personality became secrecy. Margaret watched this shift happen in real time. "They stopped looking for him," she later said. "They started explaining him." Officially, Robert Harmon was listed as missing. In practice, search efforts were minimal. There were no large-scale ground searches. No canvassing of nearby neighborhoods. No public appeals. The rest stop where his car was found was cleared within hours. Surveillance footage from nearby exits was never reviewed in full. The assumption was simple. A man who defected did not want to be found. Margaret Harmon was questioned repeatedly in the weeks that followed. Agents returned to her home multiple times. They asked about her marriage. They asked about arguments. They asked whether Robert had ever spoken about moral concerns at work. At one point, an agent asked whether Robert had ever expressed guilt. Guilt about what, Margaret asked. The agent did not answer. Their daughters were not spared. School administrators were quietly contacted. Teachers were asked to observe behavior. Counselors were instructed to report anything unusual. The family felt watched. Behind closed doors, Robert Harmon's professional life was dissected. His emails were reviewed. His reports were analyzed. His flagged concerns were revisited. Robert had questioned inconsistencies in a communications software update months before his disappearance. He had raised concerns about subcontractor oversight. None of those concerns were dramatic, but they were documented. To investigators focused on defection, those documents suggested dissatisfaction. To anyone else, they suggested diligence. As weeks turned into months, the investigation slowed. Leads were not followed. Tips were logged but rarely pursued. Margaret called the FBI repeatedly. Sometimes no one answered. Sometimes she was told there was nothing new. By the end of 6 months, active investigation had effectively stopped. Robert Harmon's case was no longer a priority. 3 days after Robert disappeared, a state highway maintenance worker named Leon Bradshaw contacted local authorities. Bradshaw had been assigned to routine maintenance at the Interstate 95 rest stop on the morning of October 14. He was not looking for anything unusual, but something caught his attention. Bradshaw reported seeing a dark-colored utility van parked near the tree line at the edge of the rest stop. It was positioned away from other vehicles. The back doors faced the woods. What stood out was not the van itself. It was the behavior of the man standing beside it. Bradshaw described him as tense and restless. He paced back and forth. He kept glancing toward the highway. He appeared to be waiting for something. Bradshaw estimated the time at approximately 7:45 a.m. that placed the sighting less than 30 minutes after Robert Harmon left his home. Bradshaw continued working but remained aware of the situation. A few minutes later, he heard raised voices. He could not make out words, only tone. Then he saw the van pull away quickly, exiting the rest stop. Less than an hour later, Robert Harmon's car would be discovered in that same location. Bradshaw did what he believed was the right thing. He reported what he saw. His statement was taken by a local officer and forwarded to federal investigators. It included a time estimate, a location description, and a basic description of the van. It was a concrete lead, one that pointed away from defection. The statement was placed into Robert Harmon's case file. No follow-up interview was conducted. Bradshaw was never contacted again. The van description was never circulated. The rest stop surveillance footage from that morning was not re-examined, because by then the theory had already hardened. Robert Harmon had defected. That choice simplified everything. There was no suspect to arrest, no crime to solve, no mistakes to acknowledge. The case required no resolution, only silence. After Leon Bradshaw's statement was filed, nothing happened. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Bradshaw assumed investigators were quietly working the lead. He waited for a call that never came. No one asked him to clarify the van's color. No one asked him to sketch its position. No one asked him to return to the rest stop. For him, the moment faded into memory. For Robert Harmon's family, the silence was suffocating. Margaret Harmon did not believe the defection theory. She knew her husband. Robert had never spoken about leaving. He had never expressed loyalty to any foreign power. He had never even traveled overseas for work. When she raised these objections, investigators listened politely. Then they returned to their questions about money, about stress, about motive. It felt less like a search and more like an interrogation. Robert's daughters struggled to understand what had happened. Their father was not dead. He was not alive. He was simply gone. At school, classmates whispered. Some repeated what their parents had heard, that Robert had run away, that he had betrayed his country. The girls stopped answering questions. At home, Margaret tried to keep routines intact. Dinner at the same time, homework at the kitchen table. Lights out on schedule, but the absence was everywhere. By the end of 1988, Robert Harmon's disappearance was no longer actively investigated. Internally, the FBI categorized the case as unresolved but inactive. There would be no task force, no annual review, no dedicated resources. The file was boxed and archived. And with that, the federal government moved on. The defection theory required belief, not proof. It allowed unanswered questions to remain unanswered. Why would a man abandon his family without preparation? Why leave his wallet behind? Why vanish in broad daylight? Those questions were inconvenient. They challenged the narrative. So they were ignored. Time passed. Robert was legally declared dead after 7 years. Margaret did not attend the hearing. Signing the paperwork felt like betrayal. She continued to list herself as married on forms for years afterward, because without answers, closure felt impossible. Inside a government storage facility, Robert Harmon's case file sat untouched. It contained photographs of the abandoned car, interview transcripts, work records, and buried among them a single witness statement. Leon Bradshaw's report. It was never flagged, never highlighted, never revisited. For decades, no one read it again. At the time, no one realized how much rested on that ignored report. No one connected it to larger questions. No one asked whether defection was the most convenient explanation, not the most accurate one. The case was frozen in place, waiting. As years passed, Robert Harmon slowly transformed from a missing man into a rumor. New neighbors moved in. Old coworkers retired. Records were archived. But inside the Harmon household, time stood still. Margaret preserved Robert's belongings. His jackets remained in the closet. His tools stayed in the garage. His notes and notebooks were stored carefully in labeled boxes. She told herself she was keeping them for evidence. But the truth was simpler. Letting go felt like admitting he would never come back. Despite official conclusions, questions never stopped forming. Why would a man abandon his children without warning? Why leave his wallet and briefcase behind? Why disappear in a public place? Even among former investigators, doubts lingered quietly. But doubts without authority meant nothing, and the case remained closed. For 30 years, nothing changed. No new witnesses came forward. No remains were found. No confessions were made. Robert Harmon became another unresolved name in a government database, a footnote, a line item. Inside a federal records facility, a retired analyst would later recall seeing the box. Unremarkable, unmarked, dust-covered, it contained a single case number and a decision that had never been questioned. In 2019, a routine audit required older, unresolved cases to be reviewed. Most were skimmed, some were discarded, one file was opened. Inside was a statement that no one remembered reading, a maintenance worker, a van, a time stamp that matched the disappearance perfectly. The analyst stopped reading and then started over. If Robert Harmon had defected, why was there a van? Why were voices heard? Why did the timeline fit abduction, not escape? For the first time in 3 decades, the original assumption cracked. That forgotten report did not provide answers, but it did something more dangerous. It challenged the story everyone had accepted. And once that happened, everything that followed would have to be reconsidered. For 33 years, Robert Harmon was labeled a traitor. The evidence that could prove otherwise was always there. It sat inside a forgotten file, ignored because it didn't fit the story investigators had already chosen. But that file has finally been opened. In Part 2, a single analyst begins re-examining the evidence the FBI dismissed, including the van, the witness statement, and the work Robert was doing just before he vanished. What she uncovers will turn a defection theory into something far darker, because Robert Harmon didn't disappear on his own, and the people who know why were paid to stay silent.